Hello, I am Susan B. Anthony. Perhaps you recognize me from my coin? I'm here to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment that gave women the right to vote. 2020 also happens to be the bicentennial of my birth. By the way, minting this coin was the idea of Wisconsin Senator William Proxmire. It was first issued in 1979. Alas, it's no longer in circulation. That is the story of the suffrage movement. Successes followed by disappointments. You have heard of suffrage? Strangely, the word has nothing to do with suffering, although we certainly did. The root of the word comes from the Latin suffragium, which can be translated to vote, support, or prayer. The word suffrage has been tied to voting rights for centuries. And we who fought for voting rights are called suffragists. In Great Britain, the women who fought for women's voting rights came to be called suffragettes as a disparagement from their opponents who were trying to minimize ladies' value. But the women proudly claimed the moniker as their own. Although we in the United States owe much to the brave suffragettes, we prefer the term suffragist, especially after the British movement became so militant. Whatever we are called, our efforts for justice have their roots in the very foundation of this country. Meet Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams. Before one word of the Declaration of Independence was written, women were pushing for equality.
And how do people with no rights get their rights? They ask for them from the people in power.
The men. Mrs. Adams wrote to her husband on March 31st, 1776.
My dearest friend, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
Sassy, isn't she?
John called me saucy and laughed at the prospect of the despotism of the petticoat, so women had to wait.
If only he and the other founding fathers had listened. It took the hard work of many generations to secure our rights, including the efforts of my good friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Oh, yes, we certainly fought long and hard. And whenever I was disheartened, Susan would declare,
"Failure is impossible."
I had been interested in equal justice issues my whole life. For example, I didn't think it was fair that women lost all rights when they married.
They couldn't sign a contract, couldn't keep their own wages.
And in the event of divorce, they had no say in who got custody of their own children.
It wasn't much better for we single women. Universities were closed to us, as were most professions.
And when women did find employment, they earned far less than men, even when doing the exact same work.
Mrs. Stanton became a suffragist the way most people of our era did, through the anti-slavery movement.
I participated in many abolitionist events, sometimes even as a delegate. I was shocked to discover that the women who attended weren't allowed to speak.
So, to help cultivate women's voices and promote equality, she gathered a few like-minded individuals and organized the first women's rights convention in her hometown of Seneca Falls, New York in 1848.
300 people attended. It was there that I helped present the Declaration of Sentiments.
Using some of the same language as the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal.
Then they declared the grievances, injuries, and usurpations on the part of man toward woman.
Followed by a list of 11 resolutions to rectify those wrongs. All resolutions passed unanimously, except one.
The resolution that called for women's suffrage.
But after much discussion, it was finally approved with the support of the eloquent Frederick Douglass, a good friend to women's rights.
Up to a point.
True.
How I wish I would have been at that meeting. But I wasn't introduced to Mrs. Stanton until 3 years later. I'd never met a more passionate suffragist and compelling writer.
And I'd never met a more organized tactician. Oh, I would have loved to travel and give speeches, but I had children and a household to manage.
And I had no such restrictions.
So I wrote the speeches and Susan delivered them. I forged the lightning bolts.
And I threw them.
When the Civil War came, we stopped our women's rights work so we could concentrate on supporting the Union, the side that would end slavery. And in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed and slavery was outlawed.
And in 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, giving all citizens basic rights and guaranteeing the ballot to males.
Then the 15th Amendment was proposed.
The amendment that gave Black men the right to vote.
I'm Lucy Stone. You may recognize my name. I was the first American woman to refuse to take my husband's name when I married. Those that followed my example were called Lucy Stoners, and I worked with these ladies right up until they refused to support Black suffrage.
We weren't against it.
Susan, you said you would sooner cut your right hand off than see the ballot granted to the Black man and not to woman.
Well, we wanted both.
And you, Elizabeth, you were appalled to think of the lower orders of men, including foreigners and Blacks, making laws for refined, educated women like yourselves.
We fought hard for abolition. We were very disappointed that the debate became either rights regardless of race or rights regardless of sex.
We didn't see why it was the Negro's hour, why we had to wait.
Because, as Frederick Douglass explained, your lives, your homes and children, they weren't threatened with destruction just because you were women. For Black men and their families, it was a matter of life and death.
The rift between Mr. Douglass and our cause remained for many years.
Perhaps because of your racist, segregationist attitudes?
And after that, we realized that we had to fight for our rights ourselves, that we couldn't rely on men. We hoped for another amendment, 16th, that would ensure our enfranchisement.
We formed our own organization, NWSA, National Women's Suffrage Association. Our motto was, men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less.
While I became part of the American Women's Suffrage Association, declaring principle, not policy, justice, not favors.
We came together again in 1890, becoming the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA.
Working under the NAWSA's umbrella did not really unite us.
There were so many inequities, social, political, and economic. Our numbers disagreed on our focus.
The differing hopes and ambitions of suffragists caused the splintering of our objectives. And then, In 1893, I was gone, never having the right to vote.
One thing we all agreed on: the world was changing.
Industrialization and urbanization. Husbands and fathers left home to go to work, giving women more responsibility and autonomy.
Up until the end of the 19th century, most of the household essentials had to be made by hand by women. And then suddenly, products like clothing, soap, and butter came from factories. Children's education was taken out of the home and put into the hands of the state. Now, these things, which firmly fall within the woman's sphere, were now beyond her control, unless she could vote.
Single women had choices besides marriage. They sought advanced degrees. They secured professional employment and paid taxes on their earnings without the benefit of representation.
And suffrage was becoming socially acceptable. It moved beyond the parlors of the upper class and into the homes of the working class. Suffragists were no longer seen as spinsters or unbalanced, unnatural women. They were young, curious, and bold. The movement was ready for a new generation of leadership.
Mrs. Stanton and I saw the birth of a new millennia, but we didn't live long enough to vote. Elizabeth passed away in 1902. I had struggled for 60 years for a little justice and died in 1906 without securing it.